The laughter that echoed through the private dining room of the Gilded Sparrow was not a sound of joy. It was sharp and cold, a shard of glass in the plush, velvet silence of the exclusive space. It belonged to Riku, a man whose presence had sucked all the warmth from the air the moment he and his entourage had arrived. Lena, standing by the service door with a silver tray balanced on one hand, felt the sound settle in her bones. She was 23, and in her 2 years working here, she had learned that the wealthiest patrons were often the most dangerous, their whims carrying the weight of consequence. Riku was in a class of his own. His suit was impossibly sharp, his stillness unnervingly predatory. His men, positioned like statues around the long mahogany table, were merely extensions of his will. They had finished their meal an hour ago, but they did not leave. Instead, a chessboard had been produced, its polished ebony and ivory squares gleaming under the soft chandelier light. Riku had been playing against his second-in-command, a grim-faced man named Takashi, and had won with brutal efficiency. Now his gaze had fallen on her. "Beat me in chess," he had said, the words slithering across the room. "And I'll marry you." The laughter followed, a punctuation mark on the absurdity. Lena's composure, the carefully constructed mask of a professional waitress, did not slip. Her expression remained neutral, her posture poised. But inside, a frantic bird beat its wings against her ribs. She was just trying to get through her shift, to pay her rent, to keep her head down. She had refilled their water glasses, cleared their plates, and offered dessert, all while making herself as small and invisible as possible. Yet he had seen her. He had seen her gaze linger for a fraction of a second too long on the chessboard, a flicker of recognition in her eyes that only a true player would notice. His challenge was a predator's game, a display of power meant to amuse him and intimidate everyone else. It was not a real offer. It was a mockery. The silence that followed his laughter was heavier than any sound. The other waitstaff hovered out of sight in the main hall, their faces pale with vicarious fear. Even Mr. Chen, the unflappable restaurant manager, stood frozen near the kitchen threshold, his usual calm authority stripped away. Rika's men watched Lena, their eyes cold and assessing. They were waiting for her to blush, to stammer an apology, to scurry away in fear. That was the expected response. That was the only response. Lena's world narrowed to the space between her and the man at the table. She could feel the weight of his stare, the collective tension of his subordinates, the silent plea from her manager to just diffuse the situation. Her mind raced through 1,000 possible replies, each one leading to a dead end. To refuse was to insult him, an act that could have untold repercussions. To laugh it off was to misjudge his seriousness, to fail to grasp the delicate and deadly etiquette of his world. There was no safe path. She looked past him, at the board. She saw the final positions of the pieces from his game with Takashi. A classic scholar's mate, executed with arrogant speed. It was a beginner's trap, a show of force against a subordinate who likely knew better than to offer a real fight. But the board itself, it called to her. It was a language she understood better than the coded threats of powerful men. The 64 squares were a world of logic, of cause and effect, where status meant nothing and strategy was everything. Her grandfather had taught her the game on a worn, wooden board in his small apartment, the scent of old books and pipe tobacco clinging to the air. He had taught her patience, foresight, and the art of the quiet threat. He had taught her that the most powerful piece was not the queen, but the mind that controlled her. Lena took a slow, deliberate breath. She let the silver tray down on a nearby credenza with a soft, respectful click. She straightened the lapels of her red vest. Then, she met Rika's gaze, her eyes clear and steady. "I accept," she said. Her voice did not tremble. It was quiet, but it filled the cavernous silence, a single, perfect note of defiance. A wave of disbelief rippled through the room. It was visible in the slight widening of Takashi's eyes, in the almost imperceptible shift of the guards standing by the walls. Mr. Chen took a half-step forward, his hand twitching as if to pull her back, but he stopped himself, recognizing the moment had passed beyond his control. Rika's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise. He had expected fear, not acceptance. He had thrown out a line to see a minnow squirm, and instead, a shark had risen from the depths to look him in the eye. He studied her for a long moment, his head tilted. He saw not a frightened waitress, but a woman of unnerving composure. Her uniform, a simple white shirt and red vest, seemed less a symbol of service and more a costume she was wearing, a temporary disguise. He gestured to the chair opposite him, a silent command. "The board will be reset," he said, his voice now devoid of its earlier mockery. It was flat, businesslike. A challenge issued in jest had suddenly become a formal duel. Takashi moved with quiet efficiency, arranging the ivory and ebony pieces on their starting squares. Lena walked to the table, her steps measured and even. She did not look at the men whose gazes followed her every move. She did not look at her anxious manager. Her focus was entirely on the checkered battlefield before her. She sat, her back straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. The chair was plush leather, a world away from the hard stools in the staff break room. A glass of water was placed beside her by a man whose face remained a stoic mask. The game was about to begin, and the stakes were no longer a joke. They were terrifyingly real. A marriage proposal from a Mafia boss was not a romantic gesture. It was a contract, a claim of ownership. Lena knew this. But her grandfather had also taught her that sometimes the only way out of a trap is to walk directly into it and spring it from the inside. The air in the room grew thick with anticipation. The clinking of distant cutlery from the main dining hall seemed to be from another universe. Here, there was only the board, the pieces, and the two opponents, locked in a silent war before the first move had even been made. Riku, playing with the white pieces, opened with the Queen's Gambit. It was a classic, respectable opening, a statement of intent to control the center of the board. It was a test. He expected her to respond defensively, to mirror his moves, to play the part of the cautious amateur. Lena did not. She responded with the Alban countergambit, an aggressive and sharp reply that immediately challenged his central control. It was a move that said, "I will not be dictated to. I will meet your challenge head-on." A low murmur went through Rika's men. This was not the timid play of a novice. Rika's eyebrows rose slightly. He accepted her pawn sacrifice, his expression unreadable, and the game quickly spiraled into a complex tactical battle. Lena's mind, once a storm of anxiety, settled into a state of crystalline focus. The restaurant, the dangerous men, the impossible stakes, they all faded into a muted background hum. All that mattered were the lines of force on the board, the potential of each piece, the branching paths of possibility that lay ahead. She moved her knight, developing a threat on his flank. He countered, reinforcing his position. The game was a silent conversation. His moves were powerful, direct, and imbued with an arrogant confidence. He played like a man accustomed to taking what he wanted, to overwhelming his opponents with sheer force. Lena's style was different. It was subtle, fluid, and patient. She built small advantages, fortified her defenses, and laid quiet traps that would not be apparent for several moves to come. She played like someone who had learned to survive by seeing the whole picture, by understanding that a direct confrontation was not always the wisest path. She was not just playing the pieces. She was playing the man. She had seen his impatience in the way he had dispatched Takashi. She sensed his disdain for weakness, his assumption of superiority. She would use that. She would let him believe he was winning, let him overextend, let him fall victim to his own pride. The only sound in the room was the soft click of the wooden pieces on the board, a sound that grew heavier with each passing minute. The game stretched on. 15 minutes became 30, then an hour. The initial novelty had worn off for Rika's men, replaced by a tense, grudging respect. They no longer saw a waitress. They saw a player. Takashi stood behind Riku's right shoulder, his gaze fixed on the board, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. He understood the nuances of the game far better than the others, and he could see what was happening. Riku was attacking, relentlessly launching assaults on her kingside, but Lena's defense was like water. It yielded, absorbed the blow, and reformed, leaving his pieces awkwardly placed and overextended. Rika's confidence began to curdle into frustration. The easy victory he had anticipated, the amusing spectacle he had orchestrated, had failed to materialize. He was being challenged. He was being forced to think, to calculate, to respect his opponent. And he did not like it. His jaw tightened. He moved his rook, placing it on an open file, creating a powerful battery aimed at her king. It was a move dripping with menace. "You play a careful game," he commented, his voice a low rumble. It was the first time either of them had spoken since the game began. He was trying to get inside her head, to break her concentration. Lena did not look up from the board. She simply slid her bishop to a new diagonal, a quiet, unassuming move that blunted his attack and simultaneously created a new, subtle threat of her own. "You have to be careful," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "When you have a lot to lose," the subtext hung in the air between them. She wasn't just talking about the game. She was talking about her life, her freedom. And perhaps, without realizing it, he was talking about his own. For the first time that evening, Rika saw her not as an object of amusement, but as an equal. The realization did not please him. He leaned forward, his focus narrowing, the mask of casual dominance falling away to reveal the raw, competitive core of the man beneath. The game was no longer a game. It had become a battle of wills. Lena felt the shift in the room's atmosphere. The tension had sharpened, becoming a palpable force. Riku was no longer toying with her. He was trying to crush her. Every move he made was a blow, aimed with precision and power. The weight of his concentration was immense, a physical pressure across the table. She could feel herself starting to tire, the mental exhaustion of maintaining such a high level of focus beginning to set in. She had been on her feet for 8 hours before this ordeal even began. A small part of her screamed to just give up, to knock over her king, and accept whatever fate followed. It would be easier, simpler. But then she thought of her grandfather, of the quiet dignity with which he faced every hardship. He had been a cleaner, a man invisible to the world, but over the chessboard, he was a king. "Never surrender the board," he used to say, his voice thick with his accent. "The game is not over until the last move is played." She drew strength from the memory. She looked at Riku, truly looked at him, and saw past the power and the danger. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes as he contemplated a difficult position, a shadow of intense loneliness. He was a man surrounded by subordinates, but not by equals. He lived in a world of fear and forced respect. This battle, this genuine struggle over a chessboard, was perhaps the most honest interaction he'd had in years. It was this observation that gave her an idea. She needed to change the dynamic, to force an error. She deliberately moved her rook to a square where it appeared to be poorly defended. It was a calculated risk, a feigned weakness. It was bait. Rika's eyes narrowed, spotting the apparent blunder. A ghost of his earlier smirk returned to his lips. He saw a path to victory, a way to finally break her stubborn defense. He reached for his queen, the most powerful piece on the board, ready to deliver the killing blow. The room held its breath. Takashi's expression became tight with alarm. He saw the trap his master was walking into, but he could not say a word. To interfere would be an unforgivable insult. Rika's fingers hovered over the queen, his confidence surging. He was the predator, and she was the prey, finally showing her weakness. He was about to win. The world seemed to slow down. Lena's heart pounded a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat counting down to the final act. She watched Riku's hand, the manicured fingers, the glint of a simple, expensive ring. He was so sure. His arrogance, which had been his primary weapon, was now her greatest ally. She had offered him a beautiful, tempting lie, and he was about to take it. He picked up his queen. The move was decisive, almost violent. He slid the piece across the board, capturing her blundering rook and putting her king in check. "Check," he said, the word a sharp, final pronouncement. He leaned back in his chair, a look of triumph settling on his features. The trap was sprung. His men began to relax, a collective sigh of relief rippling through them. Their leader had reasserted his dominance. The natural order of the world had been restored. But Lena did not look defeated. She looked calm. She met his triumphant gaze for a brief second, and in her eyes, he saw not fear, but pity. Then, she looked back at the board. Her next move was not to save her king. The check was easily blocked. Instead, her hand moved to a different part of the board, to a piece that seemed entirely disconnected from the main conflict. A pawn. A humble, overlooked pawn, standing on the 6th rank. With a quiet, deliberate motion, she slid the pawn forward 1 square. It was an impossibly simple move. An anticlimax. It made no sense. It did nothing to address the immediate threat. It captured nothing. It seemed utterly pointless. For a moment, there was only confusion. One of Rika's men let out a short, muffled laugh, thinking she had cracked under the pressure. But the laugh died in his throat as Takashi shot him a look of pure fury. Because Riku was no longer smiling. His face had gone pale. His eyes were locked on the pawn and the space it now controlled. He was replaying the sequence in his mind, his formidable intellect racing, but every path led to the same, inescapable conclusion. The pawn move, so quiet and unassuming, had been the key. It was a sacrifice, a brilliant, stunning sacrifice that sealed his fate. It guaranteed checkmate. Not now, not on the next move, but in 3 moves. And there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. The silence in the room was absolute. It was no longer the silence of tension, but the hollow, ringing silence of shock. The soft click of Lena's pawn settling onto its new square echoed like a gunshot. Rika did not move. He stared at the board, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes betrayed the storm raging within him. He traced the lines of force, the deadly web she had woven around his king. Her blunder, with the rook, had been a lure to pull his queen out of position. His own aggression, his triumphant move, had been the final nail in his coffin. He had walked into the cage and locked the door behind him. His men stood frozen, their confidence shattered. They looked from their leader's stricken face to the calm, composed woman sitting opposite him. They could not comprehend what had just happened. She was a waitress, a nobody, and she had just dismantled their fearsome leader with the grace and precision of a grandmaster. Takashi closed his eyes for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of a masterpiece. He understood the beauty and the brutality of her final move. It was not just a winning move, it was a statement. It was elegant, profound, and utterly devastating. Lena waited. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply sat there, a silent victor, allowing the reality of his defeat to settle. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been inverted. The immense, intimidating aura that Riku projected had vanished, replaced by a raw, human vulnerability. He was no longer the predator playing with his food. He was just a man who had been comprehensively, brilliantly, outmaneuvered. Slowly, as if moving through water, Riku lifted his gaze from the board and met her eyes. There was no anger in his expression, only a deep, profound astonishment. He had challenged the world and had never been met with a worthy opponent. He had built an empire on the assumption of his own superiority. And tonight, in a hushed dining room, all of it had been called into question by a 23-year-old woman with quiet hands and an unbreakable will. He had lost. After what felt like an eternity, Riku finally moved. He reached out and gently tipped over his own king, the traditional gesture of resignation. The soft thud of the wooden piece against the board was the only sound. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first sign of the emotional impact of his loss. "I see," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at Lena, and the respect in his eyes was genuine, hard-won, and absolute. "You play a beautiful game." He was no longer speaking to a waitress. He was speaking to an equal. He straightened up, his composure returning, but it was different now. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a sober gravity. He had made a public wager, a vow in front of his most trusted men. In his world, such words had weight. They were binding. To go back on his promise would be to show a weakness far greater than losing a chess match. It would shatter the foundation of his authority. A promise was made, he said, his voice regaining its strength, though the tone was now entirely serious. I will honor it. The finality in his voice sent a fresh wave of shock through the room. This was no longer a game. The absurd wager was about to become a reality. Mr. Chun, who had been watching from the doorway, looked physically ill. Lena's future, which she had fought so brilliantly to control, seemed to be snapping shut once more, a gilded cage replacing an iron one. But Lena did not look trapped. She looked like she had been waiting for this exact moment. The checkmate had not been her final move. It had been her opening gambit. I have a counter-proposal, she said, her voice steady. Riku paused, his hand hovering over the fallen king. He had expected tears, or fear, or a plea for mercy. He had not expected a negotiation. A counter-proposal? He repeated, a flicker of curiosity cutting through his astonishment. This woman continued to surprise him. She had not only beaten him, she was now attempting to dictate the terms of her victory. It was audacious. It was brave. It was utterly fascinating. I do not want to be your wife, Lena stated, the words clear and direct, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The men in the room tensed, expecting Rika's anger to erupt. To refuse his generous offer after winning was a grave insult. But Rika simply watched her, his expression intrigued. To be your wife is to be your property, she continued, her gaze unwavering. A beautiful object in a cage. I won this game to be free, not to be moved to a more luxurious prison. You owe me a debt, and I will choose how it is paid. She leaned forward slightly, her quiet intensity commanding the attention of everyone in the room. This was no longer about a game of chess. It was about power, agency, and the price of a life. My grandfather spent his entire life working for men like you. He was brilliant, but the world only saw a cleaner. He died with nothing. I will not follow that path. Her proposal was not for money, not for a car or a house. It was for something far more valuable. You have a network of businesses, she said, her knowledge of his affairs surprising him. Legitimate fronts. I want one. A small one. A bookstore, a cafe, something I can run myself. I want the deed, free and clear. I want startup capital. I want to be left alone to build my own life, under my own name. That is the price of your loss. She sat back, her terms laid bare on the table between them. It was an impossible demand. He did not give things away. He took them. To hand over an asset, to cede control, was antithetical to his entire existence. And yet, the demand was so much more interesting than a simple refusal of his hand. She wasn't asking for protection or to become a part of his world. She was demanding the tools to build her own, entirely separate from him. She wanted to win her freedom on her own terms. Riku was silent for a long time, so long that the tension in the room began to ratchet up again. He looked from her face to the board, at the fallen king and the humble pawn that had brought about its demise. He had been defeated by a strategy of quiet patience and stunning, unexpected force. And here she was doing it again. He finally let out a short, sharp exhale. It was not a laugh of mockery, but a sound of pure, unadulterated disbelief and admiration. You are, he said slowly, the most interesting woman I have ever met. He stood up, a sign that the evening was over. Takashi, he commanded, his voice firm. Draw up the paperwork. Find a suitable property. She will have what she asks for. He looked down at Lena one last time, a new, complex light in his eyes. The debt is paid, he said. But they both knew this was not an ending. It was the beginning of something far more complicated.